Thank you very much.
Chair will now be hearing from Mr. Singburi.
Thank you.
I'd just like to stand up and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you provide your full name, please?
Yeah, Pimpa Singburi.
And Mr. Singburi, you've provided two statements to the inquiry. Chair, for your reference, those are at HMIP 000685 and HMIP 000697. If I can ask for those to be adduced in full.
Thank you.
And what that means is that there's now evidence before the inquiry, so I don't need to ask you about each line, just to take you to some parts of that. So in terms of your background, you've been inspection team leader at HMIP for about 14 years, is that right?
That's right.
And you lead HMIP's immigration detention work,
Yes.
and have led all of the HMIP inspections into Brook House.
That's
So,
correct.
Starting with 2010, I think was the first one, and the most recent full inspection being in 2019.
Yes.
And before we get into the detail, can you try and explain what you see as the purpose of an inspection of somewhere like Brook House?
I think it has multiple purposes. One of the most important is to make sure that nothing is hidden, that what goes on inside immigration detention is open to public scrutiny, and that the views of detainees, experiences of people in detention are publicised. It's also about improvement. It's making sure that if centres aren't doing well enough in terms of keeping people safe, providing respectful conditions, providing enough activities, and providing enough support for them, that those things are highlighted and they have an opportunity to improve on the areas where we think they are not doing well enough.
Okay. Now, you've set out in some detail, helpfully, in your witness statement about the general process and methodology, and including the frameworks and expectations by which you inspect institutions. I'm not going to go through those in any detail. But at paragraph 14 of your statement, you note that most inspections are unannounced. And in your second statement, you qualify that slightly, although it's already qualified by saying most, by saying that on occasion, HMIP may choose to announce an inspection about 3 months in advance. Did that happen during any of the inspections of Brook House?
I can't recall exactly which ones were announced and unannounced, but almost all of them, I think, were unannounced. So the change towards making inspections mostly unannounced came in, I think it was 2013 or 14. And the reason for that was that we were concerned about the amount of preparation which some prisons primarily, rather than immigration centres, were making for our arrival. There was a particular concern about particularly difficult prisoners being moved, or people perceived as being difficult by the establishment, being moved to other prisons because the establishment knew that we were coming. So for that reason, we went to a mostly unannounced programme. We do still announce occasionally, and that is if we have already done an unannounced inspection, our findings have been particularly poor, and we want to give them a target to aim towards.
Just to, so that I'm sure I'm clear on this, so if you've given that 3 months notice, it's no longer an unannounced inspection, and presumably on the front of it, the report, it wouldn't say report on an unannounced
That's
inspection.
correct, yeah.
Okay. Now, just again at a very high level, because you've provided some detail on this, at least prior to the change in methodology, so looking at your 2016 inspection of Brook House, at that time inspections lasted 2 weeks, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And you may not use this word, but am I right in saying that the first week is sort of a reconnaissance piece of work?
It's a bit more than that. So the first week is to ensure that the research team, we have a team of professional research staff, are able to gather the views of detainees. It's also a chance for the coordinating inspector who goes in with the research team to have a first very quick look around the establishment and see if there's anything immediate which strikes them, and to give the full team, which arrives used to arrive the following week, a good summary of the main concerns, some of the potentially emerging issues which may need to be looked at in more detail. So I wouldn't see it as just as reconnaissance. I'd see it as being an integral part of the inspection, because it starts to build up the picture, which becomes richer as the inspection goes on.
And in terms of number of bodies, if you can, and it doesn't have to be exact, but roughly how many people would be at Brook House in the first week, and how many people
so
would
there'd
be
be 3 or 4 research staff. There would be a coordinating inspector, and then there would also be an inspector who we term the casework inspector. And that is a legally trained inspector who would look in some detail at Rule 35 reports. They would look at some cases, particularly those which might be most concerning. So they would be the ones who have been detained for the longest, or about whom we may have some intelligence which says they're particularly vulnerable. So they would spend time looking at the casework information database from the Home Office. They have access to that. Look at the details of the case and reach some judgments which then help the full team the following week.
But just at a high level, are we talking, 6 people there the first week?
Yeah, sorry, it would be about 6. Yeah.
And then in the second week, double that?
Roughly, yes.
And you've said in your statement, you've talked about the work of the coordinating inspector during the first week, in paragraph 16, and then in paragraph 17 you talk about the safeguarding inspector, who you say their main task is to assess how vulnerable detainees have been treated and supported. Is that different to the casework inspector?
No, that's what we now term what we used to call the casework inspector, but they're reaching their judgments by looking a lot at casework still. Yeah.
And some of the things which you've just mentioned there, so for example, they review records for individual detainees considered especially vulnerable. How do they select the people for whom they're going to review their records?
They would certainly look at people who have been held for the longest time.
And practically, does that mean asking G4S staff who's been held the longest here?
No, that could be established through Home Office records. So the Home Office will be asked, who are the longest held people here, and then we would verify that through looking at the casework information database.
Okay, and so when you talked about a sample of Rule 35 reports as well. How is that sample chosen?
So again, we would pick cases which we think might be particularly problematic because of the length of time someone's been held. Some will be picked randomly, and then others may be picked because we've had some information from elsewhere which tells us that there might be someone who's particularly vulnerable. We may be concerned about, for example, very young detainees. It could be that someone's been subject to an age dispute. It could be there's evidence of trafficking. Anything which might lead us to believe that vulnerability is increased would help to target the Rule 35 sample.
And just to check then, so when we're talking about the records you review and the Rule 35s that you look at, for neither of those is it a case of HMIP saying to G4S or even the Home Office, can you give us a random selection? It's you proactively asking for people?
Yeah, absolutely, we pick them.
Okay. Now, you say that since 2017 you've offered every detainee a confidential one-to-one interview. Prior to that, you offered some people interviews, but just a selection of people. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll come on to that in more detail in due course. Also, in relation to staff views, in 2016 you would speak to a wide range of staff, but there was no mechanism for speaking to everyone or even a formal interview process. Is that right?
Correct.
And so then, stepping back in relation to that first week, all of the information is gathered and then provided to the full inspection team that come the first day of the second week. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And
are those 2 weeks always consecutive?
Almost always, but we now have a 3-week process. So, the first week is when a coordinating inspector and research team arrive. Second week could be more interviews being conducted, and analysed, and the third week is full team. So that process is almost always consecutive. It might be because of bank holidays, because of staff availability. There could be a week in between, but I don't think that's happened with immigration detention recently.
And is it a weekday thing only, or weekends as well?
It's a weekday inspection.
And I mean, just on that point, while we're there, if I may, are there any mechanisms to ensure that things aren't particularly bad at weekends, for example? So we know that Brook House, and I'm sure other places, sometimes had problems with staffing at weekends. Is there any mechanism to ensure?
The main mechanism is asking people, and asking not just staff but asking detainees. We did experiment at a time in the past with going in at weekends to see if it would add value to our conclusions, and our main conclusion was that there was nothing we were finding out by going in on Saturday and Sunday, which we couldn't find out by asking people on Monday morning, and the major outcome was very tired inspectors. And
the inquiry's received evidence from Mr. Reverend Nathan Ward, who I think you know. If we can have up on screen, please, INQ 000101. At page 49 to 50, please. So starting at line 20 on the right-hand side there, there's some questions about HMIP, and if we can go down, please. So there's some discussion about triangulation, which we'll come on to. He says that you would get 1 or 2 hours notice, or less than that. But he says here that, I'm summarising, but essentially what he's saying is that between the initial contact, the first week where there's the survey carried out, and then the triangulation process occurs, he says that between that time, so up to the main week, extensive work would be undertaken within the centre by senior managers and staff to ensure that the best possible outcome would come on their visit. If we go down, please. Over. Thanks. So he says that files would be audited, staffing would be looked at in great detail, conversations about whether staff could have annual leave, money spent on decorating facilities, and he notes at line 18 that the phrase that Ben Saunders, who was the centre director, would use was, if the Queen was coming around your house for tea, you'd get the best china out. And on the same topic, although we don't need to bring it up on screen, Callum Tully, who was a DCO at the time of your 2016 inspection, said that they knew that the inspection was coming as they'd been told in the day or couple of days before. Although it subsequently noted that in relation to your 2016 inspection, he only became aware of it beginning on the 7th of November, which would have been the second week.
Yes. And
so, at least in relation to Mr. Tully's evidence, it is the position that he would have known that, not because there was some mole that was telling them that an unannounced inspection was coming, but because he meant the second week, and he would have known from the first week that you were coming the second week.
That seems logical, yeah.
What was it ever the case that institution, despite an inspection meant to be unannounced, that people would somehow find out about it?
So we've never been aware of that happening. I won't say it's not possible that somehow there might be information leaking out, but to my knowledge, it's never happened. People do, for the same reasons as Callum Tully thought that he knew that we were coming. People often think that it's come out simply because they've heard a couple of days after the team initially arrives, but I don't think so. Okay,
and just on the same points as Nathan Ward made, Callum Tully also said the officers were clearly on their guard, that the CSU was emptied prior to the main week, to create the impression that the centre was managed effectively without the use of real authority. And he also said staffing would be at a high to give the impression that there was no staffing crisis. So I think between them, they paint a picture that between your initial visit and your main week, the second week, that the centre would be taking quite considerable steps to make themselves look better to you. And is that something that happens all the time?
I would not be surprised if they were concerned to present the best face to the inspection team when they arrive in the second week. I think it's of very limited effectiveness because first of all, we have the team which arrives in the first week and sees the centre as it is before they've had a chance to prepare. And one reason why we have a coordinating inspector who goes around the centre very quickly on the first day is to make sure they see it as it is, and taking pictures, talking to staff, seeing detainees. So things may change a bit before the second week, and we are not unaware that this goes on. But I wouldn't say it greatly sways our judgments, partly because detainees and often staff regularly tell us that things have only just changed in the last few days. And so we're aware of it happening, and I don't think it would lead us to radically change any judgment.
So do you think the HMIP takes enough steps to guard against being misled in the ways that I've described?
Well, I think we tend to have experienced teams of professional inspectors who do this a lot. They know it's going to happen to some extent. There is a lot of wet paint around when we come in the second week. And we just have to factor that into our assessments and make sure that we don't give too much credit for something which has only happened in the last few days. And
just again, running through the process briefly. So the actions, in summary, the actions taken during the main inspection week would be going around and attempting to triangulate evidence. The presentation then of key findings and conclusions verbally on the final day. The provision of a written debrief a couple of days afterwards, which I think is pretty similar to the verbal presentation on the final day. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, in his witness statement to the inquiry, and we don't need to bring it up on screen, but your colleague Charlie Taylor described how the nature of inspection is that it provides a snapshot of an establishment. And he says that the nature of an inspector's role is that something may not come to light during the window of an inspection, both because the inspection is only over a short period of time, but also because it's difficult to uncover behaviour that is being deliberately concealed. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And did you ever, to the best of your recollection, consider that behaviour was being deliberately concealed during your inspections of Brook House?
I think we're always aware of the possibility that things could be being covered up. People, as I said, people want to present the best face. And that's one of the reasons why we have a deep dive into records and into all the available information that we can find to see if things are being covered up or things are being presented as being more positive than they really are. So I think it's possible. I don't recall that we identified any serious attempts to cover up what was actually happening.
And you also set out in your statement an overview of the post-inspection process and what would happen between inspections. I'm going to come on to that with some of the specifics later, but at a high level, what is HMIP's role in relation to an institution like Brook House between inspections?
Very minimal. So our role is to do occasional deep dive inspections to provide a good systemic analysis of what's happening in the institution. And then we pass that information over to others, so Home Office, to contractors, and it's up to them to use that information to make improvements or to make sure that things if they're going well, that things are sustained over time. But we receive intelligence and information which we'll file in between inspections and use that to help us decide whether or not we should return more quickly than we'd initially planned. But otherwise, we don't have much of a role in between inspections.
And so in terms of timing, you say that every IRC has to be inspected every 4 years. but most end up being inspected every 2
Yes,
to 3
yeah.
years. Yeah. And the decision about whether or when exactly to inspect an institution is made at HMIP's delivery board based
Yes.
on the intelligence that you receive about current concerns and risk. Is that right?
Yes, so intelligence would lead to an inspection being brought forward, potentially, but we have a schedule of inspections, so we put them in provisionally, and we might change the date if we're particularly concerned about an establishment.
Yeah, so I mean, practically, as soon as an inspection's finished, is there another one in the diary? It's just that it might get brought
If it's been a
forward.
very bad inspection, it would be, but otherwise it might take another year or so before we
Okay.
timetable it.
And in your witness statement, you say none of the intelligence received about Brook House prior to the 2016 inspection led to you considering that it needed to be brought forward. And you say that such triggers would normally be things like multiple reports of disorder, violence, abuse, or self-harm. Now, in practice, how would you expect to receive intelligence of things like multiple reports of abuse or self-harm or violence?
So we get, if there's been, for example, a number of self-inflicted deaths in an establishment, we'd always know that information. That would be sent to us. If there's been concerted disorder, that information would be sent to us too. But also, I have regular meetings with the Home Office, and they, in those meetings, give me a sense of what the major concerns are within the estate. So if there are places that have got lots of incidents happening, they will often tell us that. During the pandemic, we've been getting daily reports which give us information about what's happening in the estate, and incident reports as well. We have on an occasional basis got those on a we used to get them regularly, and then the reporting was changed, and now we get them irregularly, but we still do get some information.
So, in terms of that intelligence, you said you would be told about deaths, you would be told about concerted disorder. I'm interested to know what things come to you as a matter of regularity. So, someone is required to give you that information or give HMIP that information.
Probably only those.
Okay.
The other information we get is through our links with, those informal meetings, but also our links with NGOs who we work quite hard to stay in touch with, and they provide us with intelligence and information which we can use. IMBs are also a very important source of information for us.
But I mean, I'm going to turn to one of them as an example, but is it fair to say that in terms of the intelligence you do receive, that in some ways it's quite random about whether something reaches you or not? It's not that every appeal to the PPO reaches you. It's not that every...
Absolutely. We wouldn't get that consistency of information, no. It will be if there are particular concerns being highlighted.
But in some ways it's not that it reaches a threshold and then you get told it's... The reason I use the word random is because ultimately it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that something reaches you if someone decides to send it to HMIP.
No, I don't think that would be completely fair. I think self-inflicted deaths are always informed to us.
Yeah, sorry, I meant other than the deaths and concerted disorder. So in terms of other pieces of intelligence.
So other than those, yeah, I mean, I think there is a threshold, so that the instances of that seriousness will be notified to us. But if there are a lot of what could be termed lower level incidents, no, we wouldn't hear about those routinely.
Yeah, you might hear about them, but
we
only
might hear about them through
somebody...
NGOs. We might hear about them through other meetings, but no, we don't get routine intelligence on those.
Okay, and so for example, we had evidence this morning from the PSU, who investigate allegations of serious misconduct in IRCs. And do you think it would be sensible to have a system whereby if they uphold any allegations of serious misconduct, that those are sent to HMIP?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. We routinely make contact with the PSU when we inspect an establishment to find out what's, what their main concerns are, what are the big issues which are coming up, to help us to understand the establishment.
Mm.
But yeah, actually, I think that's
And because
a sensible
because
suggestion.
speaking to them presumably requires them to have some idea corporately, I suppose, of what's going on at a particular establishment, which they may not have had, presumably.
The PSU?
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that the PSU investigate in detail individual incidents. I'm not sure if they would routinely be keeping on top of all the intelligence in an establishment.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you about one piece of intelligence prior to your 2016 report. If we can bring up on screen HMIP 000657. Just while that's going on, you refer to this in your statement at paragraph 58A. It's an email from a doctor concerned about G4S failing to remove a detainee's restraints during a hospital escort. And the email says, I have now checked with colleagues, and I'm reading from the middle, it says, I have now checked with colleagues in hospitals close to Brook House who see patients from this facility more frequently than themselves. It seems to be the case that the use of restraints is the default position used for all transfers and not just for isolated high-risk individuals. It seems that repeated requests by medical professionals for restraints to be removed from medical treatment are ignored. I'm fully aware of the Home Office guidance about the use of restraints, and it is quite clear that G4S are routinely and regularly flouting these recommendations. At the very least, this is compromising patient care and an abuse. And if we can turn to your response to that, which I think is at HMIP 000658. I'd say it's your response, it's HMIP's response from Nick Hardwick. And he wrote back saying that they shared concern and would like to pass it to the Home Office directly as they're responsible for overseeing G4S. And the letter says, I will ask them to respond to inform us both of the action they intend to take. So, do you know whether this complaint was referred to the Home Office or G4S?
So I don't think we ever got the consent from the doctor who sent this to us. So we wouldn't have sent it on to the Home Office without getting that consent.
But this was a complaint suggesting that not that there'd been a one-off occasion where they were concerned about something, but that something they were describing as an abuse was happening all the time, with repeated requests being ignored. I know you've said that that wasn't passed on because there wasn't sufficient consent to pass it on, but does that not leave HMIP aware of an ongoing situation of abuse without having taken any steps to stop it?
Well, use of restraints is a routine concern for HMIP, and there are, in every inspection, before every inspection, there are allegations of excessive use of restraints, including on hospital escorts, quite often. And I think our response here will be to use that information as intelligence and for the full inspection coming up, and to use it to go towards deciding whether or not to bring the inspection forward. Our decision was not to bring it forward because this was, even though this is a really concerning piece of information, it wasn't something which was particularly unusual at that time. And we went into, when we inspected Brook House the following year, we looked in some detail at the use of restraints on hospital escort. We agreed with the conclusion from the doctor who sent this letter to us. And we found other evidence to corroborate, and we made a recommendation asking them to change their practice.
And so, why did you need the consent of the person telling you about it to pass it on? Couldn't you have passed it on in some anonymous form?
Well, I think it's one of the things which I may have raised with the Home Office in separate meetings. I don't remember if I did or not, but we do routinely ask consent. I don't think it's... we wouldn't send the letter on, but the concern will be raised at some other level.
So the concern should have been raised. And I know you say you can't remember, and I appreciate there was 5 or 7 years ago now.
Yeah.
But that sort of concern, even if you wouldn't forward it on, is it your evidence that that is the sort of thing that you would expect should be raised?
It's the sort of thing which I would raise with the Home Office at meetings, which I have them. with them. There are, there are a number of potential abuses which go on in closed institutions. I take all of them seriously, and they're all of great concern. But we would not necessarily bring an inspection forward on the basis of one report. And we wouldn't necessarily think that on the basis of a report like this, we should trigger immediate and serious action within the Home Office, because this is not unusual. It's serious, but it's not unusual for this sort of thing to come out.
Okay. Now, the other thing I want to ask, prior to your 2016 report, were you aware of the Stephen Shaw report that was published in early 2016? Now, I'm not going to quiz you about any of it, but do you remember, did you read that in full?
Yes.
Okay. And so findings that were made by Sir Stephen Shaw in relation to Brook House and in relation to the detention estate as a whole, would they have factored into your team's
Yes, certainly.
findings?
We discussed the Shaw report in some detail. In fact, we had Stephen Shaw come to speak to us about it.
Okay. Now, in relation to the first week of your inspection, so in relation to 2016, that occurred, and then a pre-inspection report was prepared. That's between the first week and the second week, yep. And if we have the one that was done for Brook House at HMIP 000128, if we could have that up on screen, please. Now, much of this is contained within the final report, so I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm going to come on to it when I ask you about the report itself. But if we can go to page 2, please. I'm just trying to find where I'd noted this. 1 second. Go down the page a little bit, please. Oh yeah, the penultimate paragraph, it notes that staff retention has been a challenge to the centre this year. A number of experienced staff left to take up posts at the airport, and as a result there's a relatively high proportion of new and inexperienced staff at the centre. Were you aware, the inquiries heard evidence from some witnesses about staffing being run low at Brook House in order to maximise profits for G4S? Was that something you heard evidence about when you inspected Brook House?
No, so I wasn't aware of that.
And if you'd heard that staffing was being deliberately run low, so for example vacancies being left open not just because it was difficult to recruit but because it would maximise profits, would that be something that have caused you concern?
It certainly would, yeah.
And the comment here in this week 1 report that staff retention has been a challenge, we don't. I've scoured the report and I don't think that appears in the report anywhere. Can you help with why that might not be in the report?
So in 2016 we had a slightly different methodology to the one that we have now, and our approach has always been that our focus is on outcomes for detainees. So we assess what we see in the centre. We in 2016 had much less focus on areas like leadership, under which staff retentions and staffing levels and treatment of staff would come. It wasn't at that time in 2016 having a notable impact on detainee outcomes. And I think we've established that staffing levels were actually higher during the time that we were inspecting, because I think there were more staff from Tinsley House who were supplementing the Brook House staff. So if we were looking at this now and we had this kind of intelligence, we have various other bits of evidence which we currently gather. From staff, for example, we have a staff survey which would tell us how staff morale is, how staff are feeling, whether or not they feel as if they can do the job. We look in some detail at leadership and whether leaders are enabling staff to look after detainees properly. And that includes, of course, having enough experienced staff and people, and having enough people on the ground to do the job. So I think this would come out more now than it did in 2016. And I think to that extent, I accept that our methodology has developed since that time.
Okay. If we can go to page 5, please. Under equality, diversity and faith, the bottom paragraph notes that all DIRFs, DIRFS, first of all, do you have any idea what DIRF stands for?
Discrimination Incident Reporting Form.
Excellent. Are investigated by Conway Edwards, and quality assured by Michelle Brown, functional head. There have been around 9 in the year to date and tend to relate to allegations of racism by staff. All serious allegations involving staff are investigated by the PSU. Would the reporting of 9 allegations against staff of racism within 10 months have been a concern?
Yes, that's why it's in the report.
And in relation to each of those allegations, is that the sort of thing that you would follow up and ask to be looking at each of those or looking at a sample of those?
So we would look at a sample for sure, yeah,
Okay.
on site.
Okay, I want to come on to the issue of use of force. So you say in your statement at some length about how use of force would be reviewed, including by reviewing a sample of forms, a sample of available recordings. Again, on the sampling issue, is that another situation where you would be, how would you get the sample?
So we get a list of all the uses of force, and then we will pick some ourselves. They wouldn't be provided to us.
Okay. Now, before I get into some of the details, do you consider that the process HMIP employed in reviewing use of force in 2016 allowed HMIP to properly inspect whether force was only being used when necessary and proportionate?
I do think that, yeah.
Okay. Now, the inquiries had an expert report from John Collier, which you may well not have seen, but one of his views was that there was a limitation to analysing the proportionality of use of force without access to medical records, for example, in relation to a use of force or the medical context. How do you think that HMIP can take a view on the reasonableness of force without that evidence?
Well, we didn't think force was used reasonably and proportionately in all the cases we looked at. I made a finding to say that as well. And so clearly we were able to make a judgment that in some cases it wasn't being used appropriately. Now, if there's a particular concern which relates to, for example, someone not being checked by a healthcare professional after a use of force, we would refer that to, we have professional healthcare inspectors on site with us, and so we would ask them to check out the case as well and find out if the person was examined by a healthcare professional in the establishment.
What about, for example, the fact of force being used on someone who is medically vulnerable?
So your question is?
Without access to the details of that, so their medical records that might inform whether they're medically vulnerable, does that limit your ability to actually assess the proportionality of force?
It would certainly help to understand better in an individual case if there was a particular vulnerability. We would expect that, though, to also be within the accountability paperwork that we look at. We'd also expect it to be mentioned in use of force minutes, in meetings, scrutiny meetings. So I'd hope that that information would be available. It would be a failure if that wasn't considered by the establishment itself.
Okay. Now, you set out paragraph 68 of your statement, Mr. Carroll's bullet points on use of force. He was your lead inspector in that regard. And one of his conclusions was, or one of his notes, I suppose, because it's a statistic, would be that the number of incidents of force had increased since the last inspection. Does that cause any concern in itself?
Yes, again, that's why we would report it. But we would then start to build up evidence around that to try to understand what's going on.
And another one of his conclusions was that all incidents are reviewed by a manager. Now, this inquiry has heard evidence from the use of force coordinator at the time, who at least in 2017, who was Steve Webb, whose his evidence was that he was in fact reviewing instance of use of force 2 to 3 months after it had happened. He was doing it on his own, in his own free time, as a tick box exercise, and he was looking at some instance which he himself had been involved. And the inquiry's expert John Collier also describes the instant review system as being no more than a tick box exercise. How do you explain the disparity between HMIP describing all instance being reviewed by a manager and paperwork being to a high standard, and that evidence about the extent of the review?
So I'm not sure if the finding from Mr. Collier would relate to the relevant period, presumably.
Yes,
not the
which
period,
I appreciate isn't the period.
Yeah,
you're looking at.
which isn't the period that the inspection was taking place over. So there could be several explanations. It could be that practice deteriorated, after we left. It could be that we missed things, and I'm always open to that. But I have a lot of confidence in the inspector who looked at the use of force, and I don't believe someone with his rigour would simply have missed that these were tick box exercises. So I haven't got a clear explanation for why that would be.
Because, I appreciate they might be over a different period and none of us will know the answer to that, but what the inquiry has seen is that the forms that were, the review forms, were tick box forms. For example, would Mr. Carroll have spoken to the use of force coordinator in order to reach that conclusion, or would it have just been looking at the forms?
I'd be extremely surprised if he had not done.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if you'd known the extent of the review, which I've described as the one that's been told to this inquiry, if that had been the evidence reported to HMIP, would that have been something that would have rang alarm bells?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the other mechanism or review mechanisms that was meant to be in place for use of force was meant to be monthly scrutiny meetings. And Verita, in their report, found that these were usually cancelled and hadn't taken place regularly since 2016. Is that something that HMIP would have checked in their review?
Yes, so I understand that I did notice that in the Verita report, and I think that when we checked it, those meetings were taking place. So again, it could be that because of the different time periods, things had stopped happening. Because
in the HMIP's report, and we'll go to the report, but for the reference, it's at HMIP 000613 at page 15. It was noted that use of force had increased, but governance of use of force and separation was very good. Now, I appreciate the different time periods, but again, if you were aware of the evidence to the inquiry, and if that had applied at the time you were doing the inspection, would that have been a sustainable finding that governance of use of force was very good?
Well, no. If the evidence which was presented about what was happening in 2017 was current in 2016, then clearly we couldn't have reached those conclusions.
Okay. One of the findings, and you noted just earlier that you didn't find all the uses of force to be proportionate. If we can have up on screen, please, HMIP 000613 at page 28. I'll start summarising while it's loading. So I'm going to take you to paragraph 1.53 where HMIP noted, so it says video footage revealed mixed practice, and you observed officers using verbal de-escalation effectively, but some incidents took too long to resolve. And then there's an example given of a case where although concerted efforts were made to encourage compliance, a detainee lay passively on his bed and staff unnecessarily used a shield to restrain him, and you've said that that was considered to be unnecessary and excessive. The inquiry has heard evidence, so this is obviously in October, November 2016, the inquiry has heard evidence about a similar event happening in June 2017 with a shield being used to restrain a detained person who was passively on their bed. Does that give you cause for concern that a very similar incident is happening 7 months or 8 months after your inspection?
It shows that the establishment hadn't taken on board what we said, hadn't implemented some kind of process to ensure that it didn't happen again. So yes is the answer.
And is that a good example of the limitations of the snapshot inspection, where you're there in late 2016, but you wouldn't see it again in 2017 because you're not there?
I don't think it's a limitation of the inspection. It's a limitation of the implementation of, poor implementation of recommendations.
Okay. I want to ask some questions about the liaison you do with third-party organisations. You set out in your statement the communications that you would have with the IMB as part of your inspection. If we can have up on screen, please, HMIP 000148. If we can go to page 2, which is the first email, please. So this is an email chain between you and Jackie Colbran of the IMB after your inspection. So it's after they'd seen the debrief. So I think before the full report, but after they'd seen the debrief. And Jackie Colbran was the chair of the IMB at the time, yes?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
In the second paragraph here in this email to you, it says, first, the IMB finds Brook House to be a well-run establishment, aiming to improve and with a remarkable attitude of care to the detainees from the staff. It is a shame, therefore, that this was not seen to rise above the reasonably good in any of the categories, as recognition for effort and a spur to the rest of the estate. I am sure your team must have given serious consideration to the matter, but I felt it worth sharing this thought with you. And then at page 1, if we turn back, you reply essentially explaining why your score couldn't go beyond reasonably good for various reasons, including length of detention, overzealous security, poor conditions, and inadequate activities. Did it surprise you that the chair of the IMB was effectively asking for a higher score for an institution that they were meant to provide oversight of?
So we like to have a good line of communication with the IMBs, and they provide us with good intelligence, and we try to cooperate as much as possible, and to have good discussions about outcomes in establishments we've inspected. Now, I think they clearly thought the centre was better than we did at the time. I think that was in good conscience. I think that they reported on what they were seeing. Their methodology doesn't allow for the kind of deep dive that we do, and there are risks to being on site every day, which are not such great risks for inspectors who only arrive once every 2-3 years, of perhaps not seeing what's in front of you sometimes.
And is that risk, because as you'll probably be aware, in Verita's report, they came to the conclusion that they were struck by the IMB's tendency to over-empathise with G4S and the Home Office rather than to hold them vigorously to account. Is that the type of risk that you're talking about?
It's exactly the type of risk I'm talking about, and I think the IMBs are not unaware of this. I know that in their training, it's routinely emphasised that they need to be careful about over-emphasising with establishments. They need to be very careful to maintain a sense of independence. It's very difficult to do for volunteers who do this in their spare time. And I think I'm actually surprised by the quality of many of the IMBs I come across, but here clearly I think that they'd overestimated how well the centre was doing.
Because the comment, and I appreciate it's not from you, but it's to you, that Brook House had a remarkable attitude of care to the detainees from the staff, coming 5 months before the filming, Callum Tully's undercover filming started. It's quite a shocking one, isn't it?
it overestimates what we thought was the situation at the time. Yeah.
Now, in relation to evidence gathering from detained people, you talk in your statement about your work that you would do, which in 2016 was to carry out a survey and some group interviews. And in relation to this survey, I think the sample was about 209 detainees, 76% of whom responded. And you set out paragraph 74 of your statement that 37% of detainees felt unsafe in the centre. And you say at paragraph 78 that this level is not unusual. Now, I'm going to be asking you this a few times, so I want to think about it, if you can, as an overarching thing. Is there a tendency from HMIP, because of your role in investigating so many different establishments, that you measure things against the baseline too much rather than considering it, taking a step back and considering in itself, is that problematic?
I think that's always a risk, but I think if you're trying to promote improvement in establishments, then I think it's useful to compare them to each other. A finding of over a third of detainees feeling unsafe is never good, and I think we understand that. And our approach has always been to try to dig a little bit deeper to find out why they don't feel safe. Now, I'm not surprised that detainees who have got threat of removal hanging over them, who have an insecure current situation, they don't know, what's happening with their case potentially because they've not been communicated with well enough. They're in an establishment which could look like a prison quite often. I'm not at all surprised that so many feel unsafe. I think the job for us is to work out whether that lack of safety is about poor staff behaviour, whether it's about assaults, about mistreatment, or if it's around psychological insecurity, which is inevitable if the state is trying to remove you from the country.
Now, in your survey, part of the responses to that, and you set them out at paragraph 75 of your statement, is that 18% of detainees said they'd been victimised by a member of staff. And I think in the survey question, victimised comes with the brackets, insulted or assaulted. I think that's right, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. 3% had been physically abused by a member of staff, or 3% said they'd been physically abused by a member of staff. And so in pure numbers, which is set out in the report, that's 22 people telling you they've been either insulted or assaulted by a member of staff, and it's 4 people telling you they've been physically abused by a member of staff. Other than reporting this result in your report, what do you do with this information?
So there could be, the first purpose of the survey is to make sure that we have some kind of quantitative element to our investigation. So it gives us a general sense of what the concerns may be that detainees are expressing. And then we would start to build evidence around that. So we try to find out if, for example, there have been excessive uses of force. So I imagine one of those people was the person who was restrained using a shield, perhaps.
Although you wouldn't know that, would you?
We wouldn't know that, no, because it's an anonymous survey. And we make it anonymous to make sure that people feel safe enough to fill it in, because there might be some concern otherwise about not completing it. Occasionally detainees will put their names in the survey, and if they do, then we would follow up individually on that case. Occasionally detainees will also say, they'll make a comment in the boxes we provide and put their name against that. And if that happens, then a member of the team would go to see them and find out what's beneath that comment.
So in the circumstance where, as a presumption, the survey is anonymous, so you can't, as a matter of course, find out who the 4 people, for example, who say they've been physically assaulted are, but you might, in some circumstances, be able to find out if they have put their name on it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And this is going to be very hard, because I'm sure you've done a lot of these, but roughly of, I think they said 209 surveys, I think there was probably about 150 people respond, 160. How many would be putting their names on their survey responses in your experience?
Quite a small number on the whole.
10?
It'd be very difficult for me to put a number on it,
Okay.
but it's small anyway. It's unusual.
And in your experience, are the people that put their names on it the ones that are reporting things like physical assault, or is it the other way around, or mixed?
No, it's a whole variety of things. So there could be, some people think that maybe we can help them with their cases. Some people may have concerns which are totally separate from safety.
And you also note in your statement here, and it's in the report as well, that around half of those who said they'd been victimised by a member of staff didn't report it. Would that, or did that raise a concern for you that the complaint system at Brook House wasn't functioning properly?
Well, there are various reasons why people don't report, and I think the major concern we've always had is that detainees in particular, immigration detainees in particular, are worried that if they say anything, then it will affect their case in some way. So it could be that the complaint system is not functioning effectively. It could simply be that detained people simply don't want to take the risk that if they don't particularly understand the system or understand how the complaint system works in a particular establishment, they may not want to raise their heads above the parapet.
But I suppose, regardless of whether the reason for failure to report is because of something inherent in the nature of immigration detention, or whether it's because of the specific centre, or for example, the fact that nearly half of people said that they wouldn't report it.
The outcome is that people are not reporting, when they're concerned about things.
Yeah.
And more always needs to be done to communicate with detainees and encourage them.
Do you think there is, among HMIP and also among the people who you liaise with on a regular basis, so the Home Office or the IMB, do you think there is a good understanding that the complaints they're receiving aren't the only complaints that are there, it's just the ones they're finding out about?
I think that among HMIP, I would say this, I think we understand that people will not always make formal complaints. I have always been worried personally that there is too much focus on the formal complaint system anyway, because of the fact that people don't, for whatever reason, use it very often. I think there are remarkably few complaints within the immigration detention system, and there's a reason for that. And I think probably not enough has been done to dig into why that is.
And to make people aware, presumably, of the reasons why that is.
Well, yes. I mean, there are formal complaint forms all over the place in immigration centres and in other immigration detention facilities. And I think there's a simple equation applied often, which is that if people don't pick them up and fill them in, therefore they have no complaint. That's clearly not the case.
Okay. I want to come on to ask you about some of the meetings you had with groups of detainees, and when I say you, I'm talking about HMIP rather than you individually. So you mentioned these at paragraph 81 of your statement. One of the comments that was made during that group discussion was lack of staff makes it harder for them to pick up on warning signs. Now, I'm not sure whether that was written by you or whether that was something a detainee said. Are you aware?
So if you have it in front of you, if it was in italics, it would be a comment by the centre senior management team.
No, if you say I wrote, so I think it was you that wrote it.
Right.
You say I also wrote lack of staff makes it harder for them to pick up on
Right.
warning signs.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have spotted that. Now, you note in your statement that this observation that you made wasn't commented upon by the Brook House senior managers. It's quite a significant issue, though, isn't it, if there's a lack of staff for them to be able to pick up on warning signs?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And when we talked before about the staff retention issue, and you said that at that time the methodology you employed was one where you would look at outcomes really rather than the fact of a staffing issue. Is this not a potential outcome, which is staff retention leads to lack of staff, leads to failure to pick up on warning signs?
It's a potential outcome, but it's one piece of evidence among many other pieces of evidence. So we would certainly have taken it into account. I mean, the reason why it's in that document is because we were concerned about it and wanted to follow it up as a line of inquiry to see if it led us to a firm conclusion which could be backed up by other evidence.
And I think I'm right in this again, having scoured the report, but again, this comment about lack of staff making it harder to pick up on warning signs doesn't appear in the report. Is that right?
I don't think it does, no.
Okay. And can you help us with why that wouldn't be in your report?
Well, as I say, I think we look for different pieces of evidence to back up a firm to create a firm finding. So I think we may have had that one comment. I suspect we didn't get that comment from other detainees we spoke to. We didn't see that when we observed what was happening in the centre. We didn't find other pieces of evidence to back it up. So that's probably why it didn't turn into a main finding.
Now, the inquiry is heard mostly in relation to 2017, but quite a lot of witnesses have also talked about the period prior to that, about staffing levels being a major issue among them. Do you think that, looking back, that's something that HMRP missed?
I think it's not possible to say that, because when we were inspecting the centre, staffing levels were, as I understand it, much higher than they were a few months afterwards and a few months beforehand. So I suspect we did see it when there were more staff than there had been than there were in 2017. So I'm not sure that we could infer from that we particularly missed a major finding there. I think it almost certainly, in my view, would have emerged quite strongly from other evidence if that was a big concern at the time that we inspected.
One of the other things you note in your statement is that the detainees reported most staff quite good, but some rude and don't take detainees seriously. Why wouldn't that be in the report?
Again, for the same reasons, that we pick up lots of different types of evidence and we put them together and we then give an overarching finding. So, you know, to level against that, I think we had 77% of detainees saying that staff were respectful. We had, I think in the group meetings we held, staff were mentioned as the main positive things about the centre in two of them. So when you weigh up all the evidence, we wouldn't necessarily report every piece of evidence that we get from different sources. Otherwise it would be an extremely long report without any clear conclusions.
So you wouldn't, in this circumstance, for example, just report some detainees thought the staff were rude?
We may well have done if we were getting other pieces of evidence which led us to believe that it was useful to report that, to give a real sense of where the establishment was at the time.
Okay. If we can bring up on screen, please, HMIP 000160. This is the feedback that we were talking about. Just want to look at a couple of other observations. Under respect, the third bullet is that no curtains or toilet screening, and it's noted that a full set of curtains are currently on order. And you also referred to this in your report. We don't need to bring it up on screen, but for the reference, it's HMIP 000613 at page 20, S36, where actually one of your main concerns was that the residential units remained stark and impersonal in design. Detainees felt they were held in prison conditions. The lack of ventilation was a very common complaint, and many cells were stuffy, especially overnight when detainees were locked into cells. Many cells and toilets had ingrained dirt. And then at page 33, you noted there were no curtains in many cells, many toilets in insanitary condition, cells in too bad a condition to be kept properly clean, and lack of fresh air. And this led to you making a recommendation, which again for the record is at page 20 of HMIP 613, where you recommended that concerted action should be taken to soften the prison-like living conditions. Showers and toilets should be adequately screened, and toilets deep cleaned. Units should be well ventilated, and detainees should have more control over access to fresh air. If we can bring up on screen, please, VER 000119. Maybe I have the wrong document. 1 second. Sorry, 116. Thank you. This is the service improvement plan after your inspection. And I just want to ask you about the response to this recommendation. It's at 5.2, and it says partially accepted, sorry. And it referred to a comprehensive action plan implemented to clean all rooms and toilet areas, that all showers were screened, that curtains had been installed, and the review of the effectiveness of the ventilation system had been commissioned. Do you remember, Mr. Singbury, what did you make of this response?
I didn't think this action plan as a whole was particularly good, to be honest. I thought it was, many parts of it appeared to me to be about managing the inspectorate rather than genuinely focusing on what could be done to improve matters. This response is not something I wouldn't have expected, but it's not very convincing about what's going to happen to address the concerns which we outlined.
And when it comes to things like physical conditions, which we're talking about here, what's your impression of the reason why things can get to such a bad state? Is it money? Is it a lack of appreciation of the importance of these things? Is it a combination of the two?
Well, there are a number of reasons why establishments might start to deteriorate. One is investment for sure. Another is a lack of leadership investment in keeping it clean. And a lack of sometimes people stop seeing things, which are in front of them, and maybe managers aren't getting out and about enough to make sure that they are identifying places which need to be kept cleaner, or not identifying concerns about toilets, for example. But I think one of the major ones is the fact that this is in relation to Brook House in particular, it's a centre which looks and feels like a prison, and it's designed like a prison. And as we've said many times, that's inappropriate for a detainee population.
In relation to the, just picking on one point, but on the curtains for the toilets, this is something which we've heard evidence from a number of detainees about in relation to 2017, where they say there weren't enough curtains, which meant that they didn't have the privacy to go to the toilet.
Yes.
In their rooms. In your experience, having worked with the Home Office or Angie Forrest, I think, or when I say worked with, I mean communicated with for the purposes of your inspection, do you think there was an understanding of how important things like that were to people's lives?
I think there's an understanding amongst some of them that this is a fundamental assault on dignity. If someone can't go to toilet in privacy and feels uncomfortable in their living accommodation, where they may be for some months, if not years. I think institutionally, there's perhaps less of a concerted response to these sorts of concerns. If there had been, then we wouldn't be continuously going back and making similar points.
And indeed, on that point, without needing to go to each one of them, but I understand that HMIP have been making recommendations on cleaning toilets, curtains and ventilation in every inspection since your first one in 2010. Is that your recollection?
I would not be surprised if that were the case, yeah.
And is that an example of the relative futility of making these recommendations?
No, because in other establishments change is made, and there are If you have a leadership focus, if you have proper investment, and that's not just from the people within the centre, it needs to go beyond that, it needs to go to the commissioners as well, and a real will to change things, and it can be done. Now, I think there's only so much which can be done with the design of centres like Brook House. They're very limiting. There isn't enough space, and they don't look and feel the way that immigration detention should do, in my view.
If we can go back to HMIP 000160, please. Under respect, again, the fourth bullet, fifth, it says no faith in complaints system. And that's obviously one of the reports from a group of detainees. But if we go to HMIP 000613 at page 36, please. At paragraphs 2.24 and 2.25 under the heading of complaints, there's no mention of there being no faith in the complaints system. Now, given that that was one piece of evidence you had, and I know what you've said before about the need to corroborate, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in at a higher level, but given that that was an response you'd had from a group of detainees, given that the survey had told you that 50% or about half of people would be unwilling to report a victimisation by staff, do you think that there was sufficient evidence that should have led to a conclusion in here that there's not enough faith in the complaint system?
I agree. Yeah, with hindsight, I think we should have said that.
Okay. And we've already talked a bit about it, so I won't go on further, but in your review of the enhanced methodology in 2020, which we'll come on to when looking at that issue, was it you that wrote that?
Yes.
Do you remember? It was noted that there was an understanding by HMIP as to why detainees might be particularly reluctant to report abuse, even compared to prisoners. The fact that people wouldn't want to jeopardise their cases, as the Home Office are the recipient of complaints, but also the decision maker on the detention status, also greater language problems and greater population turnover. Do you think that's something that you, as the lead inspector, were aware of at the time, or is that a realisation that you've come to in the last few years?
No, I think it's something we've been aware of for some time, and I personally have been aware of it as well. I think when inspectors come to write the sections of reports, we're trying to make them very concise. Inspectors are trying to keep out any superfluous information as they may judge it. And I think sometimes mistakes are made, and I think that with hindsight, we should have reported what detainees were saying. Okay.
Chair, I'm going to move on to another topic now. This might be a good time for a break. Can I suggest we break until 3:30?
3:30, thank you. Thanks, Bruce. Mr. Livingston. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Singbury, I want to move on to ask you about inspection in relation to healthcare. If we can just have up on screen, firstly at HMIP 000160. Again, please. So, 160. Thanks. Again, in relation to, under the respect heading, one of the findings from the detainee groups was healthcare staff can be abrupt or rude and quality of treatment can be poor. Now, in italics after that, that's the response of G4S senior managers, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
And the response says, not aware of particular problems with healthcare for mental health care, have an RMN, registered mental health nurse presumably,
Yeah.
always on duty. Is that a satisfactory response, do you think?
Well, I mean, it was their honest response, I assume. It doesn't mean to say that we took it at face value.
Because even if they weren't aware of particular problems with healthcare before, if we accept that, you just told them that they were.
Well, we gave them feedback about detainee experience, yeah.
Now, in the inspection report, you deal with healthcare in a few different guises. I'm using the healthcare quite broadly to include self-harm, suicide prevention, adults at risk, etc. as well. If we can turn to HMIP 000613. At page 23, please. Sorry to keep jumping around, Zainab. So in relation to self-harm and suicide prevention, at paragraph 1.21, it's noted that all incidents of self-harm were well investigated and any required actions communicated quickly to staff. And then at paragraph 1.22, it's noted that within ACDT documents, staff often failed to identify trigger points for self-harm. And, sorry, but if we can jump now to HMIP 000165. At page 8, please. Maybe I have the wrong page. Sorry, I think I might have just meant 160. Let me just check though. Well, let's try page 8 of this. Oh, that's right. So this is one of the comments in the confidential survey that's been extracted here. I think this was in a paper that was a collation of evidence after Panorama. And one of the comments here is better people working in healthcare because the nurses are very rude and very bad people. And for the Home Office to stop playing sick games with our heads, people nothing getting the help that they need. For example, people try to hang themselves and they say he's faking it. Who would fake something like this? People here, the Home Office and G4S are very bad people. So what I would describe this comment, and you can tell me if you disagree, is suggesting that there was a culture of disbelief, or there was at least disbelief among Home Office.
I think that particular person was describing that, surely, for sure, yeah.
And that's something that we've heard from various witnesses, that there was a culture of disbelief among healthcare staff and other staff about self-harm, and there was the idea that people who self-harm, or even some people who attempt suicide, are doing it for attention or to improve their position in their immigration case. how do you reconcile the survey response saying that people were responding to attempted hanging or attempting to hang themselves by saying they're faking it, with the conclusion that all instances of self-harm were well investigated?
Well, first of all, this is one person who made a comment in the survey. We weren't able to investigate this particular instance ourselves. So the finding that all incidents were well investigated is based on the information we were able to look at in detail. So there are often, many negative comments within our confidential survey findings. It doesn't mean they represent the overarching tenor of the institution. So our job really is to pull out, what is representative of what's happening. There will always be people who are very unhappy for obvious and understandable reasons within immigration detention. And sometimes I think in closed institutions, bad things happen, and I don't take this less seriously than we should do. I think it's a very serious comment, but I don't think it's something which could we should necessarily say represents everything which is happening within an establishment.
But even if you don't suggest that it's further, or even if you don't take it as being representative of other people who have concerns. I mean, the inquiry has heard evidence to that effect, but even if you just took it as there being one person who was saying this, and like a few of the other comments I've pointed to in relation to the detainee groups, wouldn't there be a value to including in a report the fact that somebody who's living at this institution is telling us that when somebody tried to hang themselves, they were told that they were faking it?
Well, we often do include comments like this, but again, the job we're trying to do is to represent what we think is going on in the establishment as a whole, rather than taking individual comments, which albeit very serious and very concerning, which we don't think represent the overarching performance of, in this case, healthcare.
Okay, if we can go back to HMIP 000613, please, at page 24 to 25. And this is the part of the report that deals with the protection of adults at risk. I'm just going to summarise some of it. Firstly, it's noted that there was no central log to facilitate, this is from 1.28, no central log to facilitate oversight of treatment of adults at risk, and the centre didn't know the number or identity of these detainees. 1.29, it's noted there was evidence of an inadequate response to changing risks. 1.30, despite the long average cumulative length of detention, no regular health checks carried out to determine the impact of detention on the mental health of detainees. Combined with the lack of general oversight, this meant there were no effective arrangements to monitor vulnerability over time. 1.31, no custodial staff had been trained in the guidance on adults at risk. And 1.33, the recommendation that all staff should have effective training in adults at risk guidance. Would you accept, taken as a whole, that this was quite significant criticisms of the approach to the protection of adults at risk?
Oh yes, yes.
And moving on to the issue of Rule 35s from page 30. And again, I'm going to summarise some of it from 1.70 to 1.73. In summary, it reports that Rule 35s were very brief, but most contained clear, helpful findings on scarring, but did not provide appropriate safeguards or adequate safeguards for detainees with PTSD. There's the assessment that no formal assessment of PTSD was happening, despite cases where symptoms were suggestive of it. It was noted that the Home Office had concluded that there was no evidence that further detention would have a harmful effect on the detainee's health, despite the doctor's view to the contrary in at least one case. And there was a case where the doctor had found scarring consistent with torture, but the caseworker, without explanation, had not accepted this as independent evidence of torture. Now, the inquiry's heard quite a lot of evidence about Rule 35 and the approach to it among healthcare staff. And some of that evidence has, and some of those witnesses have accepted that there was a misunderstanding about the three different limbs of Rule 35 and the criteria or the possibility of issuing reports under Rule 35.1 and Rule 35.2. At the bottom of this page, there's a short definition of Rule 35 in the footnote, which describes it as requires notification to the Home Office if a detainee's health is likely to be injuriously affected by detention, including if they may have been the victim of torture. Are you aware that that's not the right definition of Rule 35?
It was, absolutely. I mean, it's a summary, and it was a very short summary for the lay reader.
But it's wrong, isn't it? Because that says that it requires notification if a detainee's health is likely to be injuriously affected, including. But Rule 35 doesn't just require notification if a detainee's health is likely to be injuriously affected. For example, under Rule 35.2, it requires notification on any detained person suspected of having suicidal ideation.
Yes, you're right.
And I can appreciate, of course, that you might want to summarise things, but summarising them correctly is presumably important.
No, I accept that.
Okay. And do you think that this reflects a lack of understanding by HMIP about Rule 35, and particularly Rule 35.1 and Rule 35.2?
No, I wouldn't, no. I think this definition is clearly not good enough. But our findings are routinely noting the fact that Rule 35 isn't used properly. So, for example, suicidal ideation is not, doesn't often form the basis for Rule 35 reports, even when there are high numbers of people on constant watch. So our critique is usually that Rule 35 isn't being used extensively enough.
But that wasn't your critique in this report. That's your critique in the 2019 report, which we'll come on to. But in this report, there's in fact no mention at all of the failure to issue Rule 35 reports in relation to suicidal ideation. And there's no mention also of the failure to issue many reports under Rule 35.1 either, where someone's health is likely to be injuriously affected. Do you think that's an oversight, or do you think what do you think changed between 2016 and 2019 in that regard?
I think honestly we became more aware of the concern and were more focused on the fact that there were these large numbers of constant watchers, and it didn't seem right that there were so few Rule 35s on suicidal ideation in particular.
Okay. On healthcare more generally, at page 40, one of the points made at 2.57 is that more than half of detainee custody officers had received mental health awareness training as part of staff induction, which was commendable. Why was that commendable?
Yeah, I agree that was the wrong word. I think that it was at a time when we were often finding there were no staff with mental health training, and it was something which is picked up in prisons very regularly. And we thought that half of staff being trained in an IRC was a lot better than we normally saw. Now, I wouldn't use that word again. I don't think the healthcare inspector would, but I can see why it was used at the time.
So in reality, it was relatively
And
good.
in reality, half of staff not being trained is not good enough.
Yeah. And in fact, this inquiry has heard from a lot of DCOs and DCMs who say they received no training and say they should have had that training on mental health awareness. And is that something the HMIP should have been pointing out?
Well, I think we should have been stronger on it at the time, and we look a lot more closely at that nowadays.
Okay. If we can have up on screen, please, GDW 000011. This is a report which was completed by a combination of different organisations on the right to community equivalent healthcare in immigration removal centres. If we can go to page 7, please. Point 7. In notes here, and this is in the introduction to the report, I think, in the HMIP scheme, the evidence provided by those detained is treated as one source of evidence in a triangulation methodology, which will usually require evidence from 3 different sources to support a finding. No such methodology is mentioned in the CQC material on the inspection of community GP practices. Given that 3 of the 5 sources of evidence which are considered in the HMIP scheme are institutional sources, this triangulation methodology has the characteristics of an underlying systemic unfairness. There were a number of instances in the 2016 and 2019 reports on Brook House where the findings were not consistent with the evidence of those detained, but the reasons for reaching the contrary conclusion were not entirely clear. The explanation may lie in the triangulation approach. And then over the page, in their recommendations at point 6, they recommend that the triangulation methodology should be removed from the HMIP inspection framework and replaced with guidance on weighing evidence, taking into account evidence of institutionalised cultures of disbelief and stressing the need for providing clear reasoning for conclusions. What do you make of this observation and the recommendation?
So I think it slightly misunderstands what triangulation methodology means. Triangulation methodology doesn't mean that unless you have 3 sources of evidence at least, you can't mention detainee feedback or a single piece of evidence which you found. All triangulation methodology really is making sure that you've looked for as much evidence as possible to back up a finding. So we have on occasion, if we've found a very strong piece of evidence, a single piece of evidence, we will quote it. I think I gave some examples in my statement of having found individual instances where there were concerns. We couldn't find other corroborating evidence, but that was enough because it was obvious enough to us that there was a problem. Now, triangulation is all about making sure that that when we present findings to inspected bodies, they understand that those findings have been rigorously sourced. So I would defend it as being a useful approach. I don't think it would be useful for us simply to report back without any further consideration what detainees or other people have told us. I think that would be a proper role for a campaigning organisation or for an advocacy group of some sort, but not for us.
But I mean, in the healthcare context specifically, one of the problems is that although you say triangulation doesn't mean that you can't report individual complaints or pieces of feedback, I've taken you to 2 examples where you did receive individual pieces of feedback, one saying healthcare staff can be abrupt or rude and quality of treatment can be poor, one saying that people say that they're faking it when they attempt suicide. Does that not suggest that that was the approach that was taken?
I think where you're absolutely right is that we need to be... I've been talking in depth with our healthcare inspectors for some time about this very issue of reporting detainee feedback. And I think you're right that we could do better, I think, in the healthcare section in particular, in reporting what detainees have said and then going on to talk about the other evidence which helps us to put together a fuller picture of the outcome. But I think in other parts of the report, we probably report detainee feedback more strongly. And I think in future we're thinking of making a change which has more, maybe rather than a line or 2, maybe has a paragraph explaining exactly what detainees have told us, then going on to explain why we either agree with those findings or why we can't find the evidence, and what our overall conclusion is.
Okay.
It's helpful.
And if we just go back to the previous page, Zainab, please. point 8 there. It's noted there are worrying indications of a systemic institutionalised culture of disbelief within the RSC system. And it's noted the Deputy Head of Healthcare HMIP in her evidence to an investigation undertaken following the Panorama programme, which found evidence of abuse at Brook House, reported that staff have often said that those in detention overstate their complaints in order to secure their release. Now, would that be to you further evidence of that culture of disbelief I was talking about?
I think there is there is a live concern that staff don't take what detainees say seriously enough. I think it's similar in prisons, and we're concerned about the fact that if someone is expressing vulnerability, that the focus isn't always on the vulnerability they're expressing and on the experience they may be having, but on kind of speculating about the reasons why they're doing it. So I think there is a concern about a potential culture of disbelief. I don't think it's just in IRCs. I think it extends to other detained settings as well.
Okay. I want to ask about a few other parts of the 2016 report. If we can have up on screen, please, HMIP 000613 again, this time at page 7. I'll start reading while it comes up. But this is the part of the report where you said in the introduction, I would add a cautionary note on an issue that is not the subject of a specific recommendation, but has the potential to adversely affect the conditions in which some detainees are held. The proposal to bring into use the third bed, which has been installed in 60 of the two-person cells. Many staff and detainees were of the view that this would lead to a decline in living standards. This is a view shared by inspectors. Now, you were asked about why you didn't make a specific recommendation in this regard, and I think your evidence in your second statement is that inspections don't make recommendations about potential future outcomes, but only about evidence current outcomes. I mean, in this situation where the third bed had been installed, even if there weren't 3 people in the room at that time, it wasn't really a potential future outcome. It was current, wasn't it?
I think the purpose of a recommendation is to focus minds on what needs to be fixed, and by mentioning in the introduction, as a major concern that we had, I think we did what a recommendation would normally do, by raising the concern and making sure the Home Office and the contractor were aware of it. And in fact, it did eventually. I think they decided not to do that, not to have 3 people in the room.
So that's not what happened. They introduced the 3 people rooms. They introduced 60 more detainees, and then they stopped it.
Then they stopped it.
At a certain point.
Eventually, yeah.
So, if we can.
But I think if you're suggesting that making a recommendation would somehow stop them from doing it, I'm not sure that's the case.
Do you think it might have made any difference?
Well, I think the fact is we stated what our real concern was in the introduction, which is probably the most read part of the report. So I think it was very clear what we thought.
Okay. If we can go to VER 000193, please. These are the notes from a meeting you had with Ed Marsden from Verita in October 2017. So I think this was just at the outset of the Verita's investigation. And it's noted in the second bullet point that having 3 detainees in the cell is playing with fire, but it means G4S will make more money from the contract. Can you recall what you meant by that?
I can recall what I meant by the playing with fire comment. I think putting 3 detainees into a cell designed for 2. I think overcrowding is always bad. It creates incidents. It means people get more frustrated, and we'd already raised a lot of concerns about ventilation. So I think that is that was a real concern. I really don't remember the make more money from the contract comment.
Was it's obviously something this inquiry has heard evidence from lots of people about. Was the possibility of this being introduced, of these extra detainees being placed at Brook House as a means of making more money something that you were thinking about at the time?
Well, it must have been if I said something then, but I don't remember the details of it.
Okay. On another issue, which is about locking in overnight, you concluded in your report that detainees shouldn't be locked in their cells overnight, and made a recommendation to that regard that they shouldn't be, and that they should be allowed free movement around the centre until later in the evening. And this recommendation was rejected. If we bring up on screen VER 000116 at page 7. It's at the top, says, you'll see, and then the rejection, and the comment beside the rejected point says, the purpose of immigration removal centres is to provide secure but humane accommodation for detained persons in a relaxed regime with as much freedom of movement and association as possible, consistent with maintaining a safe and secure environment. At Brook House, open access to the sentence regime is provided for all detainees between 8 AM and 9 PM each day. Detainees are only confined to their rooms overnight. What did you make of this response?
Well, it's deeply unimpressive. But it was based on a rejected recommendation, so it was just a statement. It wasn't setting out how they were going to try to achieve the recommendation.
Yeah. And, I mean, again, and we're going to come to the issue of recommendations a bit at the end, but is this another example of, you can make a recommendation, they can say no to it, and you can't do anything about it?
Well, we have no enforcement powers, that's true, and we've never sought those sorts of powers. I think our role is to, be as independent as possible from the inspected bodies, to make sure that they understand the basis for our judgments, and then it's up to others to implement the recommendations which we make.
Do you have any understanding of, I mean, for one thing, maybe you can help us with this, is being locked in, is the fact of detainees being locked in their rooms or cells during that time, is that common across IRCs?
It's it is quite common, yes, yeah.
And do you know what the reason for it is? Is it money? Is it that there's not enough staff? It would cost money to pay staff overnight?
Well, I think there are several reasons normally given. One is security, and it means that overnight, if detainees are locked in cells, it means that they can't come out, and there needs to be less staff around to supervise.
But that's not security. That would be money.
No, I was going to go on to say that the obvious response to that will be to say have more staff, who are able to supervise, and then you can maintain security without locking people up overnight. So I agree. I think it is fundamentally a staffing issue.
Okay. More broadly, talking about the physical environment of Brook House. Now, we don't need to bring it up on screen, but in your 2010 inspection report on Brook House, which was just a year after it opened, I think, you noted that the centre was designed to hold detainees for no more than 72 hours. And we've heard this a number of times in this inquiry. Do you recall thinking back to then of where that understanding came from, that it was designed to hold detainees for no more than 72 hours?
I assume that we would have been told by the Home Office and or G4S,
Okay.
or the contractor at the time.
And do you have any recollection of when that intention changed?
I think it probably changed extremely quickly. It seems very unrealistic that you could have a centre designed only next to an airport, designed to hold people only for 72 hours, when we have a system of indefinite detention. So I don't think even at that 2010 inspection the 72 hours was being achieved.
Okay. And if we can go back, sorry Zainab, to VER 000193. please. Again, this is the notes of your meeting with Ed Marsden. And just reading some of the bullet points under Brook House RSCs, says misdesigned Brook House, feels like Cat B, not worst around however, Cat B, high emphasis on security. Going down a couple, design failed, HMIP not consulted, told Home Office what they thought. Is the suggestion around misdesign of Brook House and it being a design failure, is that just what we've been talking about, that it was designed for 72 hours?
Well, I mean, I think that's partly it, but as I said earlier on, I think having a centre which is designed on a Cat B prison design for immigration detainees, I think is inappropriate.
And it's noted that HMIP weren't consulted but told the Home Office what they thought. Do you remember, what did you tell the Home Office? Or what did you think?
Well, I think it would have been something along the lines of, we don't think you should be putting detainees in prison environments.
And is it HMIP's view, or I suppose your view, that detainees shouldn't be staying at Brook House?
Well, we don't think they should be staying in prison-like environments. We think that's not an appropriate environment for detainees. Now, you know, it's not our role to say whether or not the government can detain people or not detain them. And, you know, we can't tell them where to hold them. What we can do is to talk about the impact on the individual detainee of being held in that kind of environment.
And over the course of your inspections, did you get an impression of what the impact was on detainee welfare of having a centre designed for holding people for 72 hours and designed to Cat B standards?
Well, I think Brook House management have tried to mitigate the problems of having a centre which wasn't really designed to have longer term detainees in it. So by providing more activities, trying to provide more work. But it can only ever really take the edge off the experience, I think, if you do that. But it's I mean, it's an ongoing problem. You know, it's not been fully resolved.
Back to your report, HMIP 000613 at page 28. At paragraph 1.55, the report says that the 6-cell care and separation unit had been used 180 times in the previous 6 months, compared with 247 at the previous inspection. Managers worked hard to move complex and challenging detainees from the unit quickly. So this is looking briefly, I think, in that paragraph and the following paragraph, at the Rule 40 regime. Now, when HMIP does its inspections, to what extent did you inspect the reasons why detainees had been placed on Rule 40, or was it just, like, as in inspecting whether that was justified?
Yes, we do look at a sample of cases to work out whether or not separation has been justified.
Because if we turn, I think it's on the previous page, down to the bottom, it says there that one of the expected outcomes is detainees are placed in the separation unit on proper authority for security and safety reasons only, and are held on the unit for the shortest period possible. But there's no findings about whether detainees are placed on the proper authority or whether they're placed for security and safety reasons only, is there?
So we wouldn't report every single finding under the expectations. You know, they're a very long document, and if we haven't reported on it directly, it's normally because there hasn't been a concern.
Okay.
So we tend to, in the limited words we've got, we tend to put the concerns in more than just description of what we found.
Would you have inspected the issue of proper authority? Would you have considered whether it was the person with or people with the correct authority?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we would have done, but I'm afraid I don't have I can't recall the details of what the finding was on that.
Okay.
But I assume it wasn't a concern for the inspector, otherwise it would have been in here.
Okay. The paragraph 1.56 on the next page notes that the regime for separated detainees remained poor. They were held without televisions, radios, books, or other means of distraction. The unit was austere, with dirty toilets, cells that required painting, and not enough furniture. The inquiries heard evidence from a number of detainees about Rule 40 regularly being used to manage physically and mentally unwell individuals. Do you have a view, having done these inspections, about what impact such conditions, as are reported there, had on such individuals?
Yes, I mean, I think we've reported on this in a number of centres with higher numbers of people with mental health problems and serious mental health problems as well. That kind of environment isn't appropriate for people with mental health difficulties. You know, they should be held in normal location if possible, and if they've got very serious and enduring mental health concerns, then they should be in hospital.
Okay. I want to ask you some questions now about the aftermath of the 2016 inspection. So, generally, once the report is finalised internally, it's then sent to the Home Office for fact-checking. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's the Home Office's responsibility to liaise with the contractor, so in this case G4S.
That's right.
As well. Why do you go through that process of fact-checking? Why not publish the report and then invite a response from the Home Office?
Because we don't want to make any factual errors in the final document. You know, we want them to accept what we found and then take action.
So it's to prevent the risk of the report being undermined?
Well, it's to present an accurate report.
Okay.
It's the fact-checking, just to be clear, isn't a process where they can argue with our judgments. It's only a process where they can literally check the facts. You know, if we say there are 200 detainees and they say no, there are 300, then that's the kind of amendment we would make.
And if we can bring up on screen HMIP 000164, please. This is an email chain between you and Derry Hughes Roberts. If we can go to page 2, please. The top of that page is part of an email from, I think it's from Derry Hughes Roberts. And it says here, this is the correspondence about a suggested change from the Home Office when you sent your report for a factual accuracy check. And there's a point about levels of risk. And this is point 2. I've rejected their 2 points that we replace references to levels of risk with evidence levels. They are splitting hairs, and the only possible reason is an attempt to insulate their decision making from legal challenge. And I think we can see that attempted change if we bring up on screen HMIP 000667. So this is the factual inaccuracy check. And if we turn to page 5 of that, please. And I think this is it's points 8 and 9 here, where you've used the language of levels of risk, and at 9 it's suggested that it be changed to lowest levels of evidence-based risk. I think that's what that's referring to.
Yes.
And the HMIP response is that this is not at odds with our description, which is briefer and clearer to the reader. No change. Now, I know you can't speak for Derry Hughes Roberts, but the suggestion that the only possible reason for their amendment proposal is an attempt to insulate their decision making from legal challenge. Can you help us with what that means?
Well, I think you're right. I can't speak for Derry Hughes Roberts and his view. I mean, he is a lawyer, and so he would have had a very clear sense of. He would have interpreted it in a certain way. I didn't interpret it in that way myself, but I accepted what he said. That's probably as much as I can say about that.
And what did you think that this attitude from the Home Office, or Claire Checksfield in particular, who I think was the person that came back with those suggested changes, said about their approach to scrutiny?
I felt at the time there was an inappropriately defensive approach, and it was not focused enough, I thought, on the concerns which we had and also the outcomes to detainees. So, yes, I wasn't particularly impressed.
Okay. And generally, in relation to recommendations, we've obviously looked at the action plan, or the service improvement plan, I think it's called, and we've talked a little bit about the rejections being accepted, or partially accepted, or rejected. Do you think that the inability to have any powers to force the Home Office or a contractor to accept recommendations creates an inherent limitation in your role?
I think it creates, it reflects a certain approach which HMIP takes, which is to try to stay out of the process of enforcement, trying to make sure we are explicitly independent of the inspected bodies. There was a time when HMIP was less independent. It was involved more with enforcing recommendations, and we were gradually absorbed by the prison department, and we lost independence. And I think we reasserted that and made sure that we could keep ourselves away from those sorts of decision-making processes. But also, I think we should be clear that the fact that we can't enforce recommendations doesn't mean that they're not taken seriously. On the whole, we think, particularly nowadays, we think that recommendations which we make and the findings which we come up with are taken pretty seriously, I think, by the Home Office. Their implementation may not be effective all the time, and some parts of the Home Office haven't done well enough. But I think that certainly in immigration enforcement, I think the attitude has changed. This was from a time when I think the attitude was very defensive. And I think over the years that's softened and it's become more constructive.
Can you help us with why you think that is?
Change. I assume change of personnel, change of thinking.
Okay. Now I want to ask you some questions about the Panorama programme and the enhanced methodology brought in thereafter. So you set out in your statement from paragraph 96 onwards HMIP's reaction to Panorama, and you've said in your statement that it became clear that there was a staff culture issue at Brook House, which meant that staff were able to treat detainees badly without colleagues challenging or whistleblowing. And actually in the later report in 2020, which you authored, you described this as a pernicious subculture. What leads to your conclusion that the events of Panorama showed this culture or pernicious subculture among staff, as opposed to some of the other descriptions that others responded to by suggesting this was a few individuals or bad apples?
So I think that there was not only a few individuals who were behaving badly. I think a critical point here is that there are other people who knew they were behaving badly but said nothing. So I think that leads us to the conclusion that it's more than just a few bad apples. But I couldn't say that the whole culture was poor, but absolutely a subculture where not speaking up about poor behaviour by colleagues had become established.
Now, in paragraph 97 of your report, you say that HMIP did not find evidence of the type of behaviour shown in the Panorama documentary, and that's been HMIP's position ever since Panorama, I think. But what you did have in your 2016 report is, I would suggest, at least 4 detainees telling you they'd been physically assaulted by a member of staff in a survey, 22 detainees saying that they'd been assaulted or insulted, 7 of whom said it was because of their nationality. You had a finding from HMIP that the supply and misuse of drugs was the most significant threat to security in the centre. You had allegations from detainee groups that they had no faith in the complaint system, that some staff were rude. And you had a detainee saying that some of the staff, they are not helpful, they racially abuse the way they are talking to you. Isn't that combination of things, when you step back, exactly the type of behaviour that was shown in Panorama?
It wasn't exactly the type of behaviour shown in Panorama. I think Panorama was far more visceral, and there was very direct evidence of mistreatment. I think our findings are we always find some good things happening in centres, and we always find some bad things happening in centres. And I think that the reason why we put all that information in the report is to make it clear that our findings are tempered. We take a systemic view. We look over a short period of time. We can't predict what's going to happen in the future, and we can't be sure that every single instance of bad behaviour has been identified while we're on site. So we put the information in there to make sure that managers and others are aware that this has been reported. But we, from the evidence which we can verify, by talking to detainees, looking at use of force recordings, for example, we draw our conclusions on current outcomes from that evidence. So I think it's clear that we have we are concerned about things like the reporting in a survey, but we have to draw verified conclusions.
And you go on in your statement to set out some of the changes to your methodology, the change to the enhanced methodology which were made. I'm going to come on to some specific bits of that, but in summary, those changes were offering every detainee a confidential interview, asking NGOs to encourage detainees to speak with you and also for them themselves to speak to you, introducing a confidential staff survey, introducing staff's interviews, changes to the detainee survey, and also the inspection lasting for 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks now. Just to check on the length of inspection point, does 3 weeks mean 3 weeks of inspection, or does it mean it's over a period of 3 weeks?
Over a period of 3 weeks.
Because I think there's a later document which refers to the total inspector deployment at Brook House in 2019 after this methodology had come into play as being 11 days, and that being quite high. Is that right?
So it varies from centre to centre and depending on staffing availability. But the objective is to make sure we can do all the interviews and analyse them and have them ready for the time that the full team arrive in the final week.
And in relation to these changes that you've made to speak to more detainees or give them the opportunity to have these confidential interviews, can you help us with what steps, if any, were taken to ensure that the most vulnerable detainees can access those interviews? So, for example, we've heard evidence about detainees who don't have capacity.
Right.
Are any steps taken in relation to those detainees?
Well, we offer every single detainee an interview. So we would, and we do that not by putting a slip under the door always, but by speaking to people as well. So I'd hope we could identify people through that process. But I don't think, we've got no systematic way of ensuring that every person who is vulnerable speaks to us. But they've certainly got the opportunity to come forward. And we'd identify people through other means as well. So, for example, we could, the safeguarding inspector might identify someone through a Rule 35. And we might make a point of going to speak to that person. Or, we may see that there has been a safeguarding referral.
Were you aware that there was no system, I think there remains no system of independent advocates for those without capacity in immigration detention?
So I didn't, if someone hasn't got capacity, I would expect then they shouldn't be in immigration detention in the first place. So it's rare that we've come across that kind of situation. In fact, I can't remember the last time we did.
So if you came across with someone without capacity...
They shouldn't be there.
And you would report on that?
Yeah.
Okay. One recommendation that was made by Anna Pincus from the GDWG was the HMIP could offer a free phone line or online service which encouraged reports, whether in English or other languages, from detained people, not just at the time of inspections, but also between inspections as well. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable suggestion. We rely on people to phone us or email us anyway. We have people can email us at any time. The phone line isn't free, but I think we could maybe do something about that in future.
And publicise it, presumably.
And publicise it, sure.
Yeah. And under this new methodology, do you think that there is more proactive engagement with NGOs like the Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we've always engaged with NGOs and been very open to discussing IRCs with them and outcomes with them. And we regularly go to their meetings, and we have one-to-one meetings or speak at their events. I think the difference now is that we systematically, rather than occasionally, we systematically contact them at the start of an inspection and ask for any feedback.
And I think immediately when you changed the methodology, you had these random staff interviews as well as the staff survey,
Yeah.
but then the staff interviews has been discontinued. Has there been any consideration given to more targeted interviews with staff? So, for example, offering an interview or seeking to interview any staff member that had raised a grievance or any staff member that had raised a complaint. Is that something that you've considered?
So we haven't considered that in any detail. I mean, if someone fills in a survey and puts their name on it and says, "Come and see me, please," we would go and see them. So every single member of staff would get that survey, and they could communicate with us through those means. I think it would be very difficult for us to start investigating grievances. I think that's not our role. And there are, for various reasons, people may have grievances within a custodial establishment. And
but even if you're not investigating them, presumably those staff who had raised grievances, or even, for example, those staff who had been subject to disciplinary proceedings, might have a particular perspective on what's happening at the centre, which you might not hear from other members of staff.
Well, they may do. But I'm not sure if there's... I'm not sure if that would be any more legitimate than the perspective of all the other staff who were in the centre at the time who could contact us.
And in terms of other ways of engaging with people in this enhanced methodology, is there any consideration given to proactively speaking to some of the law firms that represent large numbers of detainees?
So I think in amongst the people we routinely contact, I have a feeling that we have included law firms, but I don't quote me on that because I'm not sure. I think I'll have to go back and check on that. But I think that's if we don't do that, then I think that's a reasonable suggestion. Okay.
Now, in her statement to the inquiry, which if we can have up on screen, please, the INQ 000037. I'll just start reading from this, but this is an extract for a statement from Deborah Coles from Inquest, the charity. And at paragraph 63 to 64, she says, and I'm going to summarise this, that their concern about HMIP is that the methodology and inspection approach is focused on the general at the expense of identifying patterns or trends arising from individual cases, and therefore it's not clear how you would ever identify a potential breach of the European Convention of Human Rights. And she says that if any of the oversight bodies were to hear a credible allegation or indeed encounter evidence of an immediate or recent breach of Article 3 of the European Convention, there's nothing that I'm aware of in their methodology that would ensure that this was reported to an independent body. What do you say to those concerns?
Yes, I mean, I think it's not news that we look at the general rather than the specific. We're not investigators, so we wouldn't be looking in detail at individual incidents unless they could support our general findings on how the system is operating. But we do certainly look at individual cases if that's going to give us an insight into how the centre is running and what the outcomes for detainees are. On the point about reporting Article 3 cases or any concerns, we have our own very clear safeguarding process. So if we came across cases which are of particular concern, we would use our safeguarding protocol to report to relevant bodies. We've done 2 inspections of Dover detention facilities over the last couple of years, for example. We were very concerned about the treatment of children there and the way that they were being managed within the detention setting. We reported that to the Children's Commissioner, to the Chief Inspector of Borders and Social Services as well. So there is a reporting line for us. And fundamentally, if we find something which is just wrong, we always have the option of reporting it to the police.
Okay. Now, we've talked a bit about this change to the enhanced methodology, and I've talked a little bit about that review in 2020. Now, we have that document in the chair, and we'll be able to consider it at HMIP 000671. But very briefly, are you able to tell us a little bit about that?
The enhanced methodology?
The review of the enhanced methodology.
The review of the enhanced methodology?
The 2020 review.
Yes, so the enhanced methodology came in to respond to some of the concerns which were raised by the Panorama programme, and we considered what we might be able to do better, and we thought probably the main things were to give staff a clearer way to whistleblow to us, to understand their perspectives more, and to try to reach every single detainee rather than just some of them. So this was in place for a year, and we came to review it because we wanted to see if it was working as well as we'd hoped, and also to make sure that it was financially viable for us to continue doing it, because obviously it costs a lot more to do the enhanced methodology. So the review after a year was quite positive. We reviewed the views of our inspectors. Some thought that it was a lot of resource to put into individual IRCs. Others were very keen on it. I think most thought it was a good thing to do. We also spoke to inspected bodies and spoke to the Home Office, and they were actually quite positive about having this level of oversight. And so when we did the review, we decided, this went to our delivery board where all of us, all the senior managers will get together. And we decided it was a good thing to continue. And we have done ever since.
Thank you. I want to ask you about a couple of things received after Panorama, in addition to what we've looked at before. First of all, HMIP 000156, please. This is an email from you to your colleagues. Saying a quick note to let you know that our new methodology is causing considerable unease in the Home Office in Mighty. I've had a rather petulant message from Claire Checksfield, implying to savour every word of my reply. And if we can turn to that email, I think at HMIP 000688. And the email here from Claire Checksfield, at page 2, summarising, she says, I think it would be helpful for us to have a sit down and a discussion about how you intend to report on and use the material gathered in interviews with Mighty Home Office and CNWL staff. First, I would have hoped, given our open relationship, that you might have indicated your intention before executing the pilot. This might have allowed us to have that conversation before rather than after the event. And then it talks about different accountability systems. Your response on the previous page is to basically say that the approach and methodology that HMIP you decide to use is a matter for the U, and the objective is to help identify potential mistreatment, so you're sure they'll support you. Now, just helping us a bit with this, why do you think there was unease? Why do you think the Home Office were uneasy about this?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, I thought the unease missed the point. You know, the point was to make sure that detainees didn't experience what they had experienced through what was shown in the Panorama programme. I thought it was a defensive approach taken, and I thought there was a concern that that HMIP was simply going to go into Harmondsworth and criticise everyone, which wasn't our intention. We were genuinely trying to find better ways of finding out what was going on. So I think the unease was simply because they felt that we might find more things, and it would all be critical.
Thank you. Chair, I appreciate the time. It's just after 4:30. I think I'm going to be about another 15 minutes, if that's okay, if you don't mind setting a little bit later.
That's fine with me. Mr Singhu, I assume you'd prefer that even if it means we go a little bit later than
Absolutely fine.
that we have to ask you to come back again. So thank you. Thank you, Mr Livingston. Thank you.
HMIP 000690, please, at page 2. This was an email in May 2018, so we're a wee bit after Panorama now. I've just taken a call from a new employee at Brook House who wanted to remain anonymous. He told me he had just completed the initial training course and had only been given keys and a radio and placed on a wing for a week, and was already having new staff shadowing him. He told me that one of the new staff, a woman, had been sexually assaulted by an inmate. He complained that they were very short-staffed and unable to take breaks as a result, and that the centre was out of control and volatile. He was concerned about the safety of staff. I said I would log the information and pass it on to the team leader. And then on the previous page, you forwarded that to Mary Molyneux, who was the chair of the IMB at this stage, and said to her, if you do verify any of this, I'd be very interested to hear about it. Did you receive any further information about this?
I don't recall whether I did or not. I mean, it would have been disclosure, I expect, if we did, but I don't remember.
And in terms of you raising that with the IMB, was that one of your mechanisms for raising potential concerns between inspections?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Just wanted to ask you a few questions about the 2019 inspection. Obviously, that's after the relevant period. But you set out in your statement, Mr Singbury, that at paragraph 117, that the main findings were that there was no evidence that an abusive culture was present among staff. And you also say that no assaults were reported in confidential interviews. And that point about no assaults being reported in confidential interviews is repeated in the report, I think, on 3 occasions. If we can bring up on screen, please, HMIP 000674. At page 85, please. Now, this is one of the appendices, and it's the survey results among the detainee survey. And at 9.6, you'll note there that overall 20% of people were saying they'd experienced victimisation or bullying from staff. 3% had experienced physical assault, which was 4 people. 15 people subject to verbal abuse. 11 to threats or intimidation, and 1 to sexual assault. What is the value of repeating 3 times in your report that no detainees were reporting assaults in confidential interviews when 4 of them were telling you they've been subject to physical assaults here?
So there are 2 different sources of evidence. The confidential interviews were conducted with everyone. Everyone was given a chance to come to those, and none of them told us they'd been assaulted. Now, this is the anonymous survey. So we couldn't verify, that we didn't have any names to follow up. So I don't think there's anything wrong with what we said in the report. It was accurate. But here, this is a survey finding which we had no further information on.
Do you not think, sorry, Do you not think that it presents a somewhat misleading picture to say on 3 occasions that no assaults were reported in confidential interviews, even whilst that might be true on the face of it, when you had received reports of assaults in other
No, I
through other
don't,
means?
because the confidential interviews are a very powerful source of information, and that's when we get to speak to someone face to face and understand what's going on. Now, physical assault reported anonymously is it's very difficult to understand what's going on there. It could be that there's been a legitimate use of force. It could be someone who was angry, behaving badly, attacking another detainee, and it could be a member of staff restrained them. They might report to us a physical assault, but it may not actually be one, when we investigate. But if we haven't had the opportunity to do that, then we have to report what we know.
But if 4 detainees are reporting physical assault in the survey and none of them are coming to your confidential interviews, doesn't that suggest that there's a problem with actually people being willing to speak to you in the confidential interviews?
It's possible, but I think we would. I can't think of a better way of getting people to speak to us than offering every single one of them an interview.
Okay. And so to the best of your recollection, all 4 of these people that alleged physical assault were anonymous and therefore you couldn't follow them up. Is that right?
Right, yeah.
Other findings which you note from this report is that no staff had seen an unjustified use of force, and that all staff said they'd report inappropriate behaviour. Do you think either of those findings are credible ones?
Well, we accurately reported what staff told us, and unless we can find other evidence to corroborate or disprove what they're saying, then I think that's what we're left with.
Other things in the report, and I'm summarising the way you describe it in your statement, you say that a number of concerns remained, including about detention being maintained after Rule 35, still being people being confined to cells overnight, accommodation still being prison-like, high proportion of detainees still being handcuffed during escorts. Does the fact that these concerns are essentially rolling concerns indicate that there's I've used the word futility a couple of times, but does it make you feel at least that the recommendations you're making are somewhat futile?
Well, some concerns are not resolved between inspections. That's very frustrating, and it's something which we're obviously concerned about. Many others are. So I think, we certainly don't feel that it's futile to do what we do, because, I think one of the purposes of inspection is to make sure that everyone out there knows what we can, has information which we can gather through the level of access that we have to institutions.
One of the other things in this report, and you refer to this in your statement, is that the number of use of force incidents were high without clear analysis of reasons. And you say in your statement the managers told you that in response to Panorama, there had been a drive to ensure strict compliance with reporting requirements. Did you take that to mean that things which previously hadn't been reported were now being reported?
Absolutely. And I think it was, the implication was that the lower level incidents are being reported. So, sometimes if someone is pushed or has a guiding hold used, it may not have been reported in the past, but now it is. That was my understanding.
And if we look at page 20 of this report, please. One of the key concerns and recommendations recorded here at S 43 is that during the previous 6 months, centre doctors had not submitted any Rule 35 reports notifying the Home Office that a detainee may be suffering suicidal ideation, yet in our survey 40% of detainees said they had felt suicidal at some time while in the centre. In the previous year, almost 100 detainees have been on constant watch to prevent self-harm or suicide. Is that the thing that we were talking about earlier, which is a growing realisation
Quite.
about
Yes.
the absence. Okay. Couple of final questions, Mr. Singh. In relation to the current inspection report process and looking at your current practice, do you consider that there's a sufficient focus from HMIP and sufficient experience within HMIP in identifying discriminatory behaviour by staff, whether it's towards detained people or between colleagues?
So I think there is a focus. I mean, we have a section that we have a section of our expectations which is about equality and diversity. And if we pick up concerns about discrimination, that they're reported within that section. So we have an explicit focus on discrimination. It's one of the areas which we find it difficult to pin down, what is happening in terms of discrimination often within centres and within prisons as well. And it's an area which we have been working on quite a lot over the last couple of years at least, to see if there are ways in which we can upskill ourselves, be better at identifying discrimination, and have clearer reporting on that area. So I don't think there's evidence that we haven't got the skills in the inspectorate, but the fact that we don't come up with many findings in that area has been a concern to us for a while.
And one of the suggested recommendations made by Professor Bosworth in her report is that HMIP be involved going forward with the training of DCOs. Do you have a view on that?
I think there would be no problem with HMIP perhaps having a look at DCO training. I think it will be useful for us to maybe do a short piece of thematic work to look in detail at whether or not DCOs are being skilled up sufficiently to look after detainees properly and to meet our expectations. I think we wouldn't want to get into some kind of management oversight of DCO training and get overly involved with exactly how they do it, but I think we could do a useful piece of work on whether or not they are skilled enough through the training to deliver the best outcomes.
And the final issue I want to ask you about, you've talked in your statement and Charlie Taylor talks about it in his statement as well, that HMIP is currently consulting on a change to the way it reports inspection findings, and including a proposal that you no longer make any recommendations but instead report a small number of concerns, some of which would be identified as priority concerns. But so under the previous methodology which we've been looking at, you have key concerns, which are the things that I think have the S numbers beside them, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And you have recommendations.
Yes.
And the suggestion going forward, or the proposal, would be that you still have those key concerns but no recommendations, is that right?
That's right.
And do you consider that this risks giving even less teeth to your recommendations?
I think if that happens, then our approach will have failed. And I think we need to review how it works. If we go ahead and do it, it's still under consultation at the moment. But I think we need to be very careful to make sure that we don't reduce the level of focus. Our intention, in fact, is to increase the level of focus. So, one concern from the past has been that some of the lower level recommendations are picked off and the really serious concerns are not being dealt with. So by reducing the number of recommendations, our hope is that we can really focus minds on the key concerns and get managers to spend their time looking at those rather than doing an action plan and then producing figures which show that 50% of recommendations have been met. But but all those 50% are the lower level ones which maybe don't have as much of an impact on detainee outcomes. So I think we need to be humble about it and make sure that we don't get it wrong. And that's why we're consulting so widely. But we're hoping that this approach will actually increase our level of scrutiny.
So it's a proposal that you would personally support, at least trialling?
I think we should trial it and see how it goes, yeah.
You'll be happy to know I've got no further questions for you. The chair may have a few questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Livingston. You'll be unhappy to know that I do have a couple of questions for you, Mr. Singh, but I appreciate we're running a bit late, and so I'll try and keep them brief. My first question relates in part to the last thing that Mr. Livingston was asking you about. We've heard evidence from a couple of different witnesses from both the Home Office and G4S that to a degree they viewed HMIP's inspection as a clean bill of health, and that they perhaps relied on that to show that there were no issues. You've told us, and we've also got in the statement from the Chief Inspector, that actually what an inspection does is provide a snapshot and in a time and place. Does that cause you concern to hear that the Home Office and or G4S view your inspections in a way that's perhaps different to how the Inspectorate does?
Yes, it does, and I think that if they think the 2016 report, or indeed any report that we've produced, is giving an establishment a clean bill of health, I think they've seriously misconstrued what's in the reports. There's a great deal of information in each report. Some of it is positive, some of it is negative, and we expect them to take on board all of the information and to use it to promote progress.
Okay, thank you. Question again in relation to the response to recommendations. I'm just going to make sure I don't want to misquote you. I believe that you said. Forgive me while I find it. That you were disappointed by the response, the action plan that resulted from the inspection, and it felt a little more like managing the inspectorate than necessarily engaging with some of the issues that you'd raised. Do you have any observations about whether, I mean, obviously the inspectorate inspects across a number of different bodies, so you'll be making recommendations to MOJ, to MOD, to the Youth Justice Board, for different organisations, potentially with different cultures. Do you have any observations, or do you do an analysis of whether there's a difference of approach between those organisations?
So that's an interesting question. I don't think we have a systematic analysis of that. We have perceptions, and I think our view has been that in the past the Home Office has not been as constructive in responding to recommendations as perhaps we found HMPPS to have been. But I don't think that's the case now. I mean, I think things have changed in the Home Office, and in immigration enforcement in particular, I think they have been more focused on recommendations for sure over the last few years. It's been noticeable how things have changed. And I thought the response to the 2019 report was far more constructive and clear.
Thank you. Two final things, more specific, so hopefully shorter issues for you to address. One of the issues that we've also heard evidence about during the inquiry is where there have been incidents which should have resulted in reporting, so use of force incidents, for example, but that were not recorded as use of force incidents. As an inspectorate, how do you deal with that problem? You can only look at the paperwork that's there to look at, so how do you address that tension?
Yes, so that is very, very difficult to do, and there was evidence that people weren't recording what was happening during the relevant period. I think the enhanced methodology which we brought in is partly intended to mitigate that problem. So if something hasn't been recorded as a use of force, but a member of staff in an interview tells us, look, something's happened, you need to look at it, then we could establish that something has happened but wasn't recorded. Similarly, if a detainee tells us during a confidential interview that there's been something happen, we can go and check it out and work out if we think it was a use of force which should have been recorded.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question. There's reference in the 2016 inspection report to police intelligence and the building up of a relationship with the police around a picture relating to drug use in the centre. So my question is about whether there is ongoing liaison with the police by the inspectorate from the perspective of actually obtaining intelligence to help inform what might be happening in the centre, so that you know whether or not you're inspecting frequently enough.
Yes.
Along the same lines of the PSU involvement, I suppose, is there an opportunity to actually be getting intelligence from them?
We don't do that, and I think that's a very fair suggestion.
Thank you. I have no other questions. Thank you, Mr. Singbury.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you. I know we've kept you late, and my apologies for that, but it's been important to hear from you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chair. That concludes the evidence for today. I think we'll be returning tomorrow at 10 a.m. with the evidence from 2 IMB witnesses.
Thank you very much. See you
Thank
tomorrow.
you.
Thank you.